Good evening. My name's Helen Withicombe and I'm the Programming Manager here at the Wheeler Centre. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders of any communities who may be with us today. Our guest tonight is the one and only George Megalogenis. He is a journalist and writer with over 3 decades of experience. He's the author of Fault Lines, The Longest Decade, and of course, The Australian Moment, which won the 2012 Walkley Award for non-fiction and the 2013 Prime Minister's Literary Award for non-fiction. It was also the basis for the recent ABC documentary series, Making Australia Great. Tonight, George will be delivering a lecture on his new book, Australia's Second Chance, which explores how our economic and political history has influenced and informed who we are and who we could be. Copies of the book can be purchased from the lovely folk at Dimmicks Camberwell from the back of the room, and George will be signing copies after the event. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage the man who David Marr describes as the sanest journalist in Australia, and who Annabelle Crabb refers to as Australia's best explainer. Please join me in welcoming George Megalogenis.
Bang, sorry about that. Thank you, Helen, and thank you everyone at the Wheeler Centre for extending this invitation and to the full house tonight. It doesn't look like there's an empty seat here tonight. This is a bit of a homecoming because we've been on tour for about a week. We went to Sydney, Brisbane and then Canberra to share bits of this particular story, but the Melbourne part of the story to me is always the most interesting because it was the place where Australia really took off in the 19th century. And the point of Melbourne as not just the most significant settlement in Australia at the time, but its global recognition had me thinking, as I was reading up the historical record, that we are kind of creeping back to the same spot that we enjoyed in the 19th century when we were the world's richest people. And lo and behold, a lot of the energy does seem to be sourced in Melbourne again. Now, I want to begin just by giving you a quick idea of the method. I assumed no prior knowledge, which is a very hard thing to do, especially when you spend the first few months researching a book like this, sweating what other people had written. I got to a point where there was too much to go through, and I decided to dial it back to zero and then have a look at the numbers and the record, the official record as we were going through. And when you have a look at the numbers, the most extraordinary thing happens. It's a pattern I didn't spot as a working journalist and wasn't something I was familiar with in other people's work, but that this country tends to run in super cycles. Its good times tend to last for more than a generation. They tend to run for about 50 or 25 to 50 years, and the bad times are almost of equal length, which when you think of a land of drought and flooding plains, is there something you would worry about? What would happen if we actually get it wrong in the future, because our history does tell us that when we're on a downer, it tends to run for a lot longer than the generation that made some mistakes. We tend to repeat our parents' mistakes, or if you look at the plus side of the equation, we tend to also build on our parents' good fortune. Now, in assuming nothing, one of the things I also did was also explore my parents and my and ancestors' stories. So I didn't realise that I had a great-grandfather who came to Australia, for instance, in the late 19th century, who was registered under the... he was registered as an enemy alien under the Wartime Precautions Act during the First World War, which is quite extraordinary given that Greece actually fought on Australia's side. Same problem for the Italians in the First World War because they also fought on Australia's side. But look, be that as may, the most fascinating story, and he's a pretty quiet chap and he's not here tonight, so hopefully he won't be looking this up on the internet later, not very tech savvy. My father's story is, it's in the book because it's emblematic, not because it is a heroic story, but it is a typical story. And he wasn't going to get in unless his anecdote fitted a particular immigrant wave in the post-war era. So he gets in not because he's atypical, but because he's typical. I took it a step back and did some research on the boat that brought him to Australia. It was a boat called the Serena, and it had a reputation for poor hospitality. It had been, now remember the word boat, you'll probably figure out why I'm telling you this story. It had been a New Zealand troop carrier during the First World War and a hospital ship in the Second, before it was decommissioned and sold to a Greek shipping company to service the post-war migration trade. On its first voyage from Italy to Australia in 1949, it carried 663 passengers. This isn't Dad's trip, by the way. This is its first trip to Australia. And there were representing 30 nationalities. There were only 17 English migrants on board who had secured tickets for the trip. When the vessel docked at Fremantle on the 2nd of April 1949, those 17 English made a beeline for the reporter from the Sunday Times to unload. Now, there's a guy called Mr. J.A. Baxter. He was the first one quoted. He's from Lancashire. "This is the worst ship anyone could hope to travel on. It might be all right for foreigners, but it's not all right for us." Catalogue of complaints. The pita bread and the dips he didn't like, the spaghetti did not agree with him, and the ship, whilst it did serve tea, it did so often without milk. And he said, on several occasions, the butter was putrid. And then a woman called Mrs. C. Davies sort of hopped in. She's from Stratford-on-Avon. Now, I don't think she's a descendant of Shakespeare, but she may have been. "Hungry? You're telling me. We could all do with a nice chop and egg when we get ashore." Now, there are 180 migrants from Malta on this particular trip, the first trip that the Serena took to Australia. There was a priest with them, Father Andrew Enriquez, and he complained that the cabin were poorly ventilated and there was little privacy in the sleeping quarters. When I complained about it, I was told simply, "But are they not third-class passengers?" This is the Greek captain talking back to him. I took the trouble to point out that third-class passengers are human beings too. Now, after he lodged his complaint, the priest did get a temporary upgrade so he could hold prayer services, but this is where the captain delivered his final insult. He upgraded him to second class, but he said the only free space he had was the ship's bar. Now, the captain was a chap called Nicholas Votsis, and he said his grumpy customers were, quote, telling lies. Everyone had plenty of food, he said, and ham and eggs were provided for the English. Now, standards did improve on the return leg to Europe, according to the Australian passengers who were intercepted by reporters at the Fremantle stopover on the way out. There's a chap called Mr. M. Riley, a seasoned traveller for Katoomba in New South Wales. He said he expected the worst. "Before I boarded the ship at Melbourne, I bought a quantity of food for the voyage and DDT to ensure cleanliness." He was going to fumigate the cabin before he settled in. But I found on the trip to Fremantle that she was the cleanest ship I have ever travelled in. The chief steward changed the food on the menu to suit my requirements. I found the staff most efficient. Now, my father was just 16 when he picked up this particular hell ship a year later. He's from the Greek island of Ithaca, and his 1 month's journey to Australia in April 1950 is worthy of Ulysses. He took a local ferry first from Piraeus, the main port of Athens, to Port Said in Egypt via Lebanon and Cyprus. At Port Said, he checked into the first hotel he'd ever stayed at and waited for 5 days before connecting with said hell ship, the Serena. There are 800 migrants on board. All had purchased second and third class tickets as per the previous ship voyage described in the papers. The Greek captain didn't want to see the first class deck go to waste, so he grabbed his passenger list and called out all the Greek names on it. One by one, he told his startled passengers that he was giving them a free upgrade to first class. Unfortunately, Dad still had a rough trip. He'd caught chickenpox along the way and was quarantined from his fellow first-class travellers. Now, this ship, as it entered Fremantle, didn't get a single line in the West Australian. There were obviously no complaints from the migrants on board. It docked on the 19th of May, but at its final destination at Port Melbourne's North Wharf on the 26th of May, the media was back in its element. Now, this is Dad's trip, by the way. It's infamous. The Argus reported that 200 Greeks had tried to invade the ship. Quote, about 10 customs officers, this is before they were the border force, formed a human barrier and forced the people back behind the wooden barriers protecting the wharf in a desperate effort to get off the ship to meet the waiting people. Many of the, quote, 800 Greek migrants aboard the Serena lowered their luggage over the ship's sides on ropes, essentially a riot on North Wharf. Now, I read this passage when I dug it out. read a passage to Dad, and he did laugh. He said, "Is that what they wrote? There are only 50 Greeks on board," and as he said, they've been travelling first class and had disembarked ahead of the others. The journalist appears to have confused the small Greek contingent with a much larger group of Italians. But who could blame him? I mean, to an Australian eye in 1950, the Southern Europeans all looked the same. Now, that particular beat-up ran on page 3 alongside a report of a UFO sighting in Sydney, which is where the punchline comes. Was it Venus or a real flying saucer, the headline asked? Of course, Elvis isn't a global figure at this point, so he's not riding the spaceship. At the end of the article, there was a subheading declared that a UFO had also been spotted in the Melbourne suburb of East Malvern, just about 10 minutes away from here, or 10 k's away from here. The witness was a retired police inspector, Mr. H. Wrigglesworth. I was never sure about that surname. He may have made it up. It was at a terrific height and the shape of a balloon with a small tail which appeared to be spinning, he said. Now, here's the coincidence for us in our little family tree. East Malvern was the suburb where Dad would buy his first home, so presumably that UFO was directing him to the property market in Melbourne where he would enter. Now, I sort of give you that as a bit of a byway, but pretty much every migrant, I think, has a version of a first contact story like this. And in researching the book, I was trying to look for the first contact. And of course, first contact isn't actually Arthur Phillip, it's James Cook. And when he claimed the east coast of Australia for Great Britain in 1770, guess what? The locals rejected his gifts and took aim with their spears. And this is a quote from his diary, which I think is the quote that sort of sets up this long conversation between new arrival and local forever and a day. All they seemed to want was for us to be gone, he wrote. Now, looking at this from the other perspective, from the migrants' perspective, most migrants, if they are greeted in a sort of less than wholly welcoming way, tend to absorb the insult with a whispered assertion of cultural superiority. Now, trust me, every migrant does a version of this first contact story. The recipient of the sledge differs through time, but the substance hasn't altered. It's the English, obviously, who set the tone when they dismissed the locals, in their words, as savages, and seized the country from them. Arthur Bowes Smythe, he was a surgeon on the First Fleet. Some of you may be familiar with his rather lurid account of what happened the first day the women came ashore. He thought Indigenous men were, quote, stupid and indolent, close quote, but otherwise harmless. And here's the quote that stands out for me. They did not appear hostile. Their language is excessively loud and harsh and seems to consist of a very short vocabulary. He wrote this in 1788. That could be any continental Asian migrant over the past 70 years, sneering, or maybe observing, the speech pattern of typical Australian, whether they call them a bogan or a yobbo is up to you. It's not a term I would use. Now, of course, these lousy first impressions of new arrival as alien and Aussie as moron are erased once the migrant joins the mortgage belt and sends their children to the top of the class, and the locals find to their relief that the country remains familiar and is more affluent. Now, of course, the two parties cement their relationship by yelling together at the next intake. Now, here's the curious thing, and it's always puzzled me. Our story as a migrant nation has very little room given to its economic aspect. It's a cultural story only, and depending on your perspective, we are either the world's greatest host or an irredeemably racist people. Now, when I was approaching the task of writing a book about migration, the first thing I wanted to do was to avoid picking a favourite tribe, because it's obvious it'd be the Greeks, but you don't want to write a story about the Greeks and everybody else's story around them. And I didn't want to write a book that was excessively negative or even positive. I wanted to take us through the conversation between new arrival and local. And of course, it's quite typical that the new arrival has a version of this first contact. We don't want them, we want them gone. Now, the question of whether a new arrival can become Australian is always front of mind for the locals. What's always puzzled me, as I say, it's a curious national trait that we would focus on the cultural, not the economic side, is it never occurs to an American to question whether a migrant is going to fit in. A, they think the migrant will embrace the American identity, and B, they're quite confident that a migrant will add to their economy. And in fact, Americans view migration as essential to their nationhood, recognising that migrants literally made the United States. As I say, Australians prefer this story in a cultural sense. They are more likely to talk about the benefits in terms of the food. Now, this is something interestingly, and I never picked him up on it because I thought it would be rude to pick him up on it, but people like Malcolm Fraser back in the day would say things like, best thing we ever did as a country was open the doors after the Second World War because the migrants brought terrific food, which is true, but I wouldn't have thought that was the only reason we did it. The reason why this is a curious national trait, why we stick to the culture, not the economic story, is you'd have to admit that Australians obsess about the economy more than any other people on the planet. So not to be able to put the migrant part of the migration into the economic story while we worry about interest rates and property prices and the current account deficit and all the other things tells me that we haven't been telling this story to ourselves the right way. Now, I didn't know that when I started out. I knew that there was something I could add to the history of this topic. But as I went through the record, most of the stories get told from the perspective of the host finally accepting the new arrival. So most of the history is actually told from somebody who thinks they were born here. Now, of course, most of us come from somewhere else. Now, if you actually look at migration through the economic lens, the periods of our greatest prosperity in the 19th century are associated with large-scale migration and free trade. Between the founding of Melbourne in 1835, and this is a statistic I didn't expect to find, but it's a very interesting one, and the peak of the land boom in 1891, our national income, as measured by Australia's gross domestic product per person, quadrupled. Now, from a standing start in Melbourne to 1891, we were the world's richest people for the best part of that half century. Now, Australia became the world's richest settlement in 1852. In that year, Melbourne was the most visited port on the planet. Now, the next best result in that 50-something year period, almost 50 years from 1835 to 1891, is the United States. You shouldn't be surprised with that. But they only doubled their national income over the same period. So we grew twice as fast as they did. The flip side of this, and this is where it gets really, really interesting, our weakest period, when we grew slower than any other nation on the planet, was the first half century of white Australia, from the 1890s to the eve of the Second World War, when we restricted both migrants and goods. In fact, growth is not quite the right word because our national income stagnated. Now, understand what this statistic tells you. At the bottom of the Depression in 1931, GDP per person happened to be lower than it was in 1891. So over a 40-year period, the world's richest people went from a settlement everybody wanted to be a part of to a small country with a small population that was to be pitied. And in fact, for those of you who know your Depression history, it was Australia that got the equivalent of Greece's treatment today with a big austerity package to tell us basically how to cut our costs and how to sack all our public servants and how to reduce all our pensions and the like. Now, the interesting thing for me, because as I said, I want to earth this particular presentation in the Melbourne story. Melbourne was the capital of open Australia, undeniably. Now, Victoria took just under 50 years to reach a population of 1 million. It took New South Wales twice that period. Actually, sorry, just a bit over 50 years to get to its first 1 million people. It took New South Wales twice as long. In fact, they both arrived at 1 million in 1877. It's quite an interesting statistic. So all the way through, Melbourne thought it would be the capital of Australia when it got federated. The next 50 years is when the bust came, of course. Guess what happened to Victoria? It actually disappeared off the map. Now, the reason why people still today laugh at Melburnians when Melburnians do the Melbourne-Sydney comparison is that they assume that there used to be a point when Melbourne was number one. Well, of course, that is correct, but for the rest of Australia, a lot of people don't quite understand this. New Zealand got from 1 million to 2 million by 1919. Victoria waited until 1945 before it reached its 2nd million person. So it did this for the first 50 years and then stagnated for the next 50. And in fact, New South Wales is actually approaching a population of 3 million when Victoria was at 2 million. So we literally went from the capital of open Australia to an afterthought when the country federated, and certainly into the 20s, the 30s and the 40s. And here's the interesting part of the story. Victoria, from the bottom of the pile, it was the least diverse state apart from South Australia on the mainland in 1947. It actually restored over the next 20 years its position as the capital of open Australia, because most of the migrants after the Second World War went here. A few went to New South Wales, of course, but essentially most of the Greek, Italian, German, Yugoslav, Polish migration, most of it came to Victoria. Second choice, New South Wales, and then the British went to South Australia and Western Australia. So it does interest me that a place like this, once the doors get open again, becomes the place that most migrants go to. The question is why? I wonder whether in the back of people's mind globally there's this idea of Melbourne as the capital of open Australia. Now, the thing about the position we're in today is, as I'm flagging, we've been here once before. These first surprising, unsettling decades of the new millennium have actually brought us to the position we did enjoy in the 19th century as a settlement to be envied. In the 19th century, of course, as I mentioned, we're the world's richest people. Today, we're the only rich nation that could say it avoided the GFC, and it had been growing uninterrupted for 24 years. Once again, our society reflects the best of the world back to it. In the 1870s, when Australia enjoyed its greatest advantage of living standards over the United States, the population was split almost 50-50 between migrants and local born. Today, most of you probably have heard this statistic, almost half the population is either first or second generation, 28% born overseas and 20% with at least one parent who was a migrant. I think the question of who we are now has never been more fascinating or confronting. Now, in the past, regardless of whether a state had a high or low proportion of people born overseas, the distribution in each was the same. The British were top, followed by, after the war, the Italians, and then from the 1970s, the Kiwis. This meant that high and low migrant states remained broadly familiar to one another. So if you could imagine, even though a Melbourne or a Sydney would have a high ethnic population, essentially the hierarchy would be identical in high and low migrant states. Today, and this is essentially what the data tells you, the country is moving in three very different directions. One part leads to China and India, another towards the mother country, and the third towards Pacific. Our Eurasian self is concentrated here and in Sydney, our Anglo-Celtic self is in Perth and in Adelaide, and this new Pacific identity is taking shape in Brisbane. The Chinese have already replaced the Brits as the largest overseas-born group in Sydney. The Brits still have the largest migrant community here, but are likely to drop to third behind the Indians and the Chinese by the end of the next decade. Amongst migrants aged under 35 in Sydney and Melbourne, the British are already ranked third behind the Chinese and Indians. In Perth and Adelaide, another statistic that blew me away when I read it, not only the British unchallenged, they have almost the same population share that they did under white Australia. So we're getting a lot of British migration on the Indian Ocean side, and most of the European, what remains of the European wave and now the Asian wave is coming to the southeast corner of Australia. But in Brisbane, of course, and I said the nation is breaking in three different directions, it's the Kiwis who are poised to overtake the British as the number one overseas-born group. Now think about what that means for the national conversation. Sydney and Melbourne are a lot closer than they've ever been. Brisbane is somewhere else, and Perth and Adelaide are looking to the old country. I mean, good luck to any politician trying to juggle that. I think we've just seen some rather interesting examples over the last three prime ministers where people have assumed that the country is still the same country and have wondered why it has reacted quite curiously to some of the, let's say, unoriginal or unrepresentative things our politicians have said to the population. Now, the post-war restoration, which we're broadly familiar with, took Australia from a position where only 10% of the population was born overseas to, as I said, 28% today. Now, we're a nation of roughly 23.5 million people. Now, when the Americans were 23 million people, their overseas-born population was only 10%. So keep that figure in mind, 28 for us, 10 for them. So we are close to 3 times more diverse than the Americans were for the same population base. Today, of course, America is a much larger country. Only one of the 50 American states, California, looks remotely like us. It has an overseas-born population of 27%. Only 2 others, New York and New Jersey, have rates above 20. Now, as I say, the interesting thing about what these statistics are telling you is that this country looks like it did in the 19th century. America doesn't look like anything in particular. I'll explain why. The most revealing difference between Australia and the US today is not just the proportions of their respective migrant communities, but their compositions. We've actually become more diverse as we've increased our overseas-born population at the very same time that the Americans are losing their diversity. The best way to see this is to actually divvy up the 28% of Australians who are born overseas. 10 percentage points of that 28 from Asia, 9 are from the old empire quartet of Britain, Ireland, New Zealand and South Africa, and 5 are from Europe, and just under 2 are from the Middle East. That's not a bad spread over that 28. In the United States, they've only got 13% born overseas, just over half are from Latin America, most of them are from Mexico. Only 4's from Asia and less than 2's from Europe. If you were betting on a country to win in the 21st century, of the old sort of Anglo nations to actually keep its head above water while power shifts from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you'd bet on Australia to win, because Australia, as I said, is reflecting the best of the world back to it. Now, the logic to these population flows are that migration is getting increasingly localised. There's a good reason why the Americans are drawing most of their people from Latin America, because that's the neighbourhood in which they're operating. There's just as good a reason why Europe is drawing so many refugees from Syria, because that's the nearest port of call for people fleeing that conflict. Australia, though, is drawing extraordinary, sorry about the alliteration there, unintended. Australia is actually drawing a highly mobile middle-class migrant from 2 rising nations, China and India. Now, the reason why I say there's an echo in the past in all this is that the Chinese and Indians are coming to Australia for the same reason the British were coming in the 19th century. They're leaving, but with a strut. They're not cowed migrants like previous generations. They're leaving a rising nation where you've had industrialisation, very rapid industrialisation, and big population shifts from rural areas into the city. Beijing and Mumbai look like London did in the 1850s, relatively speaking, to the migrants who are leaving. Crowded, corrupted, environmentally degraded. And they're coming here obviously for a better life. But they're coming here for a better life with very, very deep pockets. Now, what are we going to do with this as a country? This is the thing that I've been trying to figure out in the book. I don't come to the fork in the road of Australia, the position we find ourselves today, where the country is almost back where it found itself at number 1 in the late 19th century, and think it's just going to continue, because the lesson of the past was when we got this rich, when we didn't even have to ask and people would come here, I think we got greedy. We were sitting on a big pile of cash at the end of the 1880s, and we did 2 things that we shouldn't have done. We began to select who would come. We decided we'd go to what became the White Australia policy, and we didn't want to trade with cheap foreign suppliers. So when we closed the doors, the rest of the world said, good luck with that, and forgot about us. It's not that they waited for Australia to realise the error of its ways. Remember, we're a small settlement at the other end of the globe, and through the 1890s and 1900s and 1910s and 20s and 30s and 40s, periods of tumult, depressions, wars. The depression that we suffered in the 1890s, we suffered the worst. We were the first one in, the last one out. The depression of the 30s, as I flagged, was the depression where the rest of the world made an example of us. Why do people do this to us when we're off our game? I suspect the rest of the world, to the extent that it thinks about Australia, thinks that we're sitting on a bounty. You can't help but make something of this country. But if you get greedy or if you get fearful, the rest of the world think that we've blown our inheritance, and they tend to overreact. I think they tend to punish us on the downside more than, well, I don't know. I don't want to draw equivalence with the treatment of Greece today because there's a different issue. But I think they would look at a country like this, and if it was off its game, we would pay a price that we probably couldn't anticipate at the moment. It may not be the equivalent price that we paid at the end of the 19th century, but it may be a 21st century manifestation of us. From what I understand of a lot of the international opinion of Australia, now this is sort of the elite economist political opinion, is that they think we're on the verge of something, we're on the verge of becoming something terrific. But they think it could go only one or 2 ways for us. Either we do become the place to be, or we become just another settlement, just another country to be ignored. Sorry, another country with potential, but was ultimately ignored. Now, I don't want to bring you down too much with that particular thought, because I still think, whilst the short term is a bit tricky for this country, we can't help but win, because the rest of the world is projecting success onto us. Now, rather than worrying about the past, one of the things I wanted to do with this book was get a sense of the language of Australian exceptionalism and also Australian negativity. Now, the Australia that turns away from the world, the Australia that closed down, this is the Australia that, in some people's estimation, is almost perpetually irredeemably xenophobic. Now, I went looking for the first race card as part of an example, just to test the theory about how bad we are at these things when we're off our game. Now, a race card is what? A race card is when one side of politics accuses the other side of politics of letting the wrong person in. We've actually had, more often than not, a agreement on both sides of politics about migration policy. The White Australia policy obviously began as a bipartisan policy, which was a closed-door policy, and the open immigration program after the end of the Second World War was clearly bipartisan as well. But guess which side of politics played the first race card? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I would have intuitively thought it was the Conservatives, because I would have thought that the Conservatives, because of the way they position themselves today, have always had, a sort of a greater identity with British Australia, and they'd be more wary of Germans and Italians and Greeks and the like. But it turns out the first race card, when one side of politics decided to attack the other's migration policy, was the Labor Party. Now, there may be some Labor supporters in this audience tonight. I don't want to bash you too hard, but this is an interesting exercise because the language itself echoes pretty much every conversation I've covered in the last 30 years in politics with somebody worried about whether it was the Vietnamese or the Chinese or migration from the Middle East. This race card was played very deliberately late in the late 1920s when the Depression was just about to hit us. And in fact, we went into recession a year before the Wall Street crash. The then opposition leader was a guy called Matthew Charlton, who subsequently retired and was replaced by James Scullin. In February of 1928, they moved a motion of no confidence against the Bruce Page government. Here's Matthew Charlton's opening speech. I'm just going to quote a couple of lines. I'm going to quote the whole speech. And his argument was essentially an economic one. We must first find employment for our own people, and then, if we could bring a couple of 100,000 of our brothers and sisters from Great Britain, mind you, they're still supporting the White Australia policy, and give employment to them, we should all welcome them gladly. Now, the Labor Party position, which began in the late 20s, which lasted up until John Curtin and until he opened the gates again after the Second World War, was that not another migrant could arrive from anywhere in the world until the unemployment rate came down. Now, Matthew Charlton was being quite polite. He was talking about the British, but what they were really talking about was the Italians. Now, there's a guy called Francis Ford who was Prime Minister for 8 days. Some of you may have heard of him. He was the Labor member for the Northern Queensland electorate of Capricornia. In this particular debate, and I'm going to quote him at some length because, as I say, there are resonances in these quotes. The Labor Party is not opposed to the Italians as a race, he said. We admit that they make good settlers and are useful workers. I recognise too that they are white men and that their country is noted for its art, science and learning. Many of them have done good pioneering work in Queensland. Labor's concern, he said, that's a direct quote, the whole thing is a direct quote. Labor's concern, he said, was that the Italians, quote, do not understand our arbitration laws and industrial conditions. He said that business wanted to, quote, induce them to work for less than the award rate and thus break down the conditions of employment operating in Australia. Now, that election campaign is a very interesting one because those of you who know your Ben Chifley history would know that Ben Chifley came up with this slogan. Campaigning for the Blue Mountains electorate of Macquarie that year, this is a quote attributed to him in November of 1928, he accused the Bruce Page government of putting, quote, Dagos before heroes, close quotes. The government had allowed so many Dagos and aliens in Australia that today they are all over the country taking work which rightly belongs to all Australians. Now here's the redeeming part of this particular anecdote. Whilst Chifley won the seat and Labor achieved its best result in New South Wales since 1914, in Queensland, where that card was played, where the Italians actually concentrated in relatively large numbers, there wasn't a swing against the government. This first race card fascinates me because the story most politicians will admit to you privately today hasn't changed, and that is in the electorates where there is migration, resistance to migration is at its lowest. Australians do get along with the object of their misapprehension. It's in electorates like Chifley's, where there were lower numbers of migrants, where you could play a card like this and get away with it in the short term. The only way to really beat this card is to keep the doors open. Now, the following year, Labor didn't win that election, but the following year they had another go at this. Now, 1929 is viewed by political historians as this sort of work choices Mark I election, where the coalition went too hard on industrial relations and there was a big landslide, and Bruce himself, Stanley Bruce, lost his seat. Now, the race card was played again that year, and it's interesting because it was just played around the corner in Paran. For those of you who remember the last state election, that's the first seat at a state level that the Greens took off the Liberal Party. So it's a pretty groovy part of Australia. Not so in 1929. Bruce was addressing a rally on the Wednesday before polling day at Paran Town Hall. When Mr. Bruce rose to speak, there were shouts of, quote, "importer of blackfellows and the Dago's friend." Now, the Labor Party had stacked that audience with trade unionists who were accusing him of letting in Italians. Now, why have I focused on this particular one? As I said, I identified it as the first race card played by either side of politics. It is the familiarity and the repetition of the language that is of interest to me. I don't think we've evolved that much as a nation, but I don't mean that in a bad way. Essentially, this story redeems itself in the post-war migration program. Because guess who opened the door to Italians after the Second World War? Ben Chifley. So people like Ben Chifley and John Curtin and Arthur Corwell spent a lot of time in the 20s and 30s arguing against migration because they thought the unemployment rate couldn't fall if they let another foreigner in. What happened to them by the end of the Second World War is that they realised that Australia doesn't work if it's not connected to the rest of the world and it doesn't have people coming here. They found very quickly, once they opened the doors after the Second World War, that the unemployment rate went to 1.5% by about 1949, and it stayed there for the best part of the 50s and 60s while the doors were open. When people say to me, and a couple of people have asked this question, what is your so-called counterfactual? What is the opposite to your argument? How can you prove that migration, that the absence of migration leads to economic chaos? Now, people will say 1890s was a depression, 1930s was a depression. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. The decade, the 20s, when the Americans did keep their doors open for a few years, but we were restricting Italians and Greeks and the like, that was the weakest decade of growth that we've had. It was the decade where we barely recovered the loss from the First World War with the British migration we allowed in. That's the decade, without going too much into historical detail, that actually proves the counterfactual. That when you restrict migration, even when you're letting some people in, you can't, for some reason, whatever switch gets flicked in Australia that takes us from chip on the shoulder and inferiority complex to outrageously optimistic and incredible host. Whatever switch you flick in Australia, you have to switch it fully. It has to be flicked fully. You can't be half-baked about it, because the time we were half-baked about it, which was the 20s, we were once again, the weakest economy of in the world at the time. Now, we were measuring America, UK and Europe at the time. Now, the interesting thing about the Labor Party and its position on race is that after the Second World War, I would assume that you wouldn't have seen a repetition of this particular language. I would have thought that once the doors had opened after the Second World War, that Labor would basically end up where it ended up today, as the party that is pro-migrant, with the coalition being the one, for whatever reason, having switched. But Labor actually still try to have it both ways, and there's a particular debate which may have some resonance for people today. Now, I'm going to give you a little tip on how to read this book if you do want to read it. I don't try and bang the reader over their head with a 21st century connection. So there are a number of obvious contemporary resonances, but I'm not going to bash you over the head each time and say, see, this reminds you of Tony Abbott a couple of weeks ago, or this reminds you of John Howard, or this might remind you of Julia Gillard, and, foreign workers should go back to the end of the queue. Don't want to do any of that. I just want to tell the story as it happened. But after the Second World War, and this is a particular sliding door for our family, because my mother would not have come to Australia, and of course I wouldn't be standing here giving you this particular presentation if Arthur Calwell had been elected Prime Minister. Now, Calwell in 1949 was still the Immigration Minister, and he played probably the most outrageous race card against the then Menzies-led opposition when they were trying to deport all the wartime refugees back to Asia. Now, there is obviously a bit of a resonance here because the particular case of a woman called Annie O'Keefe was quite notorious at the time. He was going to kick her out and her 8 children, even though the High Court said she could stay. Calwell actually decided that the High Court couldn't decide who come to this country. So he went to amend the law, and he gave a particular speech as he was running this campaign. And this is 1949. He's doing this in an election year. He's flying the flag for White Australia. I am determined that the flag of White Australia will not be lowered so long as the Labor Party remains in power. We shall insist on maintaining our sovereign rights to determine what people shall make up our population. Okay. Now, John Howard's not aware of this quote, but clearly there is some repetition, subconscious repetition that occurs in public life where you reach for this thing and you end up sounding like a Chifley or a Calwell or even a Henry Parkes in the 19th century. It just is what it is. Now, the opposition, of course, supported the White Australia policy, and bear in mind what Calwell's trying to do. He's trying to make Menzies appear to be the friend of the Asian. Now, what did Menzies do? I'll tell you, this blew me away when I read it. He's opposition leader, his last chance to be Prime Minister. What does he do? He stands up to Calwell. He criticises Calwell for his disregard of morality and law. I'm going to read you this quote. This is in a white-hot debate in Parliament in 1949. In the name of common sense, they're debating this particular piece of legislation that will essentially override the High Court and allow Calwell to choose which Asian refugees from the Second World War he'll kick out of the country. In the name of common sense, what harm would have come to Australia or to a policy supported by every Australian political party if Mrs O'Keefe and her children had been allowed to remain here for some years longer, or let's face it, even permanently? This is Menzies speaking. He thought that Calwell's bill was internationally offensive. He was concerned that it placed the White Australia policy at risk of challenge in the UN, and on a personal level, he thought the pursuit of the O'Keefe family was vindictive. Now, of course, we haven't heard a Labor person say this for the last 15 years, but it would be interesting if one of them would read these speeches of Menzies in 1949 and wonder what courage might look like from opposition. There will be a widespread impression in this country that the Minister, by not making an exception in the case of the O'Keefes, is not only taking away from them at one stroke the fruits of their successful appeal to the law of this country and to the High Court as his interpreter, but is also engaging in a singularly unpleasant process of victimisation. During the election campaign, Calwell kept banging this drum. Menzies, in a number of his campaign speeches, attacked Calwell from opposition. So the reason why I dug this one in particular out is that the two of them obviously had a bit of history by the time they came to the 1961 election. The 61 election famously is the one that Labor came within a seat of winning. Menzies had no idea that between him and Harold Holt they'd engineered a recession that was probably unnecessary at the time. The press had turned against Menzies, the Sydney Morning Herald campaigned against him, and he was almost out on his ear. Calwell's policy in the 61 election was to slow the migration program, which he, bear in mind, had started. Now we're talking about Europeans, we're not talking about Asian refugees, and he said he didn't want to let another person in until full employment had been restored. And if he'd won that election, my poor mum wouldn't have made it here in 1962. The point I get to when I read some of this record is, whilst you can be very, very pessimistic in the short term when you read some of these things, the longest story in Australia, and it's now the best part of our story, the best part of the 19th century and the best part of the last 70 years, is that we've found our open selves again. We've almost found it consciously now, because what occurred in the 19th century was clearly an element of unconsciousness, because these were colonies not yet federated. But over the last 70 years, we've been able to bring this country back to a position where the rest of the world is interested in what happened next. Now, the last time they looked at us like this, we blew it. I trust that whatever urge we get in the next 10 or 15 years to sit on what we've got, not to share it with the rest of the world, to issue demands to the rest of the world, to tell it how it should do its business, to leave us alone, that we resist this, because if we don't, what our history tells us is it will be quickly forgotten, and the bottom takes a long time getting up off. Now, I'll leave it with that particular thought. There's a couple of minor measures. On the cover, we did have a Richmond footballer, and we assumed that they'd still be alive in the final series, so we could be flogging this book to Richmond supporters, but we'll look away. It wasn't my choice to put him there. The other thing is, it is true that the previous book was launched in the middle of a leadership challenge. Rudd challenged Gillard the week the Australian Moment came out in early 2012. Luckily, we got the timing spot on this time, because we published a week after the change in Canberra. So without any further ado, I will hand back to Helen and throw some questions to the floor. Thank you for listening so carefully.
Thanks, George. Now, I will be throwing to the floor for questions, so please get them ready. But while you're gathering your thoughts, I do have a couple of questions. You've actually segued into it very nicely. I was wondering about the timing, because at the end of your book, not to give anything away, a lot of your, I wouldn't say negative thoughts, but what concerns were based around Abbott. What are you thinking 2 weeks later?
I haven't seen any evidence that the government's policies have changed. So the concerns are not really about Abbott. The concerns are about what the last few years have been about. So I do refer, not in the book, but I have referred to the Rudd, Gillard, Abbott era. Now, that's a tricky thing for both Labor and Liberal people, because they think, come on, the other side are clearly worse than what we are. Ever since we got, it does puzzle me. I know it puzzles a lot of people in politics, because they look at the hand that's been dealt Australia and they think, how can you get this wrong? But the last few years have been rather ordinary in public life. And a lot of it has come after we avoided the GFC. It's as if the Great Escape left us wondering not what comes next, but after you do something like that, the next thing you hear from your leaders ought to be really grand. It ought to describe the next 20 or 30 years of your country. Now, it's very difficult, I think, in public life now with the way the media operates, the type of people who've been attracted to politics in the last 20 years, who, bear in mind, have entered public life at the time when there didn't seem to be big problems to solve, not the sorts of problems that Hawke, Keating and Howard had to solve. A lot of the culture is driving them to react in the short term. The electorate itself is asking for things that clearly no voter should ask for, but politics doesn't know how to tell the voter, hang on, you're asking for too much. I think the electorate, and I have been thinking this for a number of years, I think the best thing they can do when you're getting bad leaders is to continue to flip them until one side or the other calms down. So Abbott's in the book in the sort of present past, I think. Everyone is kind of present past. We had to assume that all the prime ministers were essentially historical figures. I was quite confident in a sort of analyst sense that he'd be gone before the next election. And so the book isn't framed towards... the assumption on him isn't that it begins and ends with him. The assumption is that he's a manifestation on the Liberal side of something that's already occurred on the Labor side, which is this, for want of a better an analogy, both sides of politics in terms of their asylum seeker policy are behaving in that late 19th century way, which is that the rest of the world can
work it
bugger
out
off,
themselves.
work it out for themselves. It's not our problem. A lot of that, even though I don't go into detail in the book, a lot of that middle class welfare that we've seen the last few years is also another manifestation of that sort of control, that sort of protection era policy. Attitudes, obviously, on the Liberal side on climate change, and Malcolm Turnbull hasn't changed his policy, are a 21st manifestation of the tariff. So we want to set our own prices and let the world figure it out for themselves. Now, the difficulty for us, especially on the asylum seeker issue and in climate change, is that we're part of a global system, and if the last rich nation standing can't be a price leader, if it can't be a moral leader, the rest of the world will eventually slap a price on our head that we don't like. And that's the thing that still concerns me, notwithstanding the change in leadership, because on both sides of politics, the impulses are to do what? It was Kevin Rudd, not Tony Abbott, that came up with the idea of transporting asylum seekers to Manus Island and then resettling them in places like Cambodia. Now, it's not the morality necessarily that I'm concerned about in the book. I am concerned about it, but I want to be a bit more evidence-based. It's what the rest of the world will do to us when it decides that we've got ahead of ourselves. That's the thing that's concerning me in the short term.
Does anybody else have any concerns that we can resolve right here, right now? We've got a question over there.
Or if you want to talk the country up.
One of the things, as a first-generation migrant, one of the things that I find really odd is the concept that we should stop boats for their own good so they don't die at sea. How did we get to that level of conversation about this, do you think?
I think the concern, and you do see this in one of the earliest dispatches that a governor sent back to London. In 1800, the then Governor King told London that it didn't want any more Irish terrorists coming on boats. I'm not making this up. I could have just done 45 minutes and basically run the race card all the way through, but that would have been a pretty even bleaker presentation. I think an island continent on the other side of the world that's always been small enough to fear inundation, because it's always feared inundation. It's worried about the uninvited migrant. See, but your question is, how did they get themselves into the brain space that say, we're doing this as a favour to you? Good question. I think at some sort of subconscious level, both sides of politics realise that the just don't bother is a bad look, and I don't think that is. I think they were self-aware enough not to want to say that. But it does take a particular genius to then come up with this other idea that will stop them from drowning. Yes, but of course you could stop them from taking the boat by clearing the camps. And what we've seen in Syria is you could take 12,000 like that, and public opinion says, hooray, finally. Now, that said, though, I think a nation does have a right to secure its borders. So I don't think the position, just let them all come on and basically allow it to be an unregulated migration that third parties cash in on and do put them on leaky boats. I don't think that is moral either. But we have to be realistic about these things. At some point, what's occurred on both sides of politics the last few years is going to matter to the Indonesians. And when the Indonesians decide that they no longer want to protect us from our own worst impulses, they could do terrible things to us. They could basically let 50,000 come. And we have to trust that their political system is going to keep this thing on an even keel, because the way we've behaved the last few years. Now, both sides of politics will tell you this privately. They wished Kevin Rudd didn't have a dust up with SBY over the Oceanic Viking. Liberals will tell you that Abbott was a little too belligerent in his dealings with both the current and the previous Indonesian leadership. Now, again, a good question about the drowning. It is quite an interesting construct, but I'm not sure that the electorate ever bought it, because I'm not sure that asylum seeker issue is a top of mind, category 1 vote switch the way a Medicare or education would be, or interest rates. It's always been a category 2 issue, but Labor's basically been bluffed on this issue since 2001 because Howard won an election that appeared to all money to be lost to him before he stopped the tamper.
Do we have another question over here?
George, we remember when you worked for The Australian, we thought you might have been a bit biased against the Labor Party.
Now you're convinced.
I'm sure that's no longer the case, even if it were. But I did observe that all your examples that you used were Labor Party rather than the Conservatives that you used to this audience. My idea as a Labor supporter is perhaps in your thesis you may have either missed or not gone into a more complicated thing that comes out of the Labor Party attitude, that is to say the importance of people working in Australia getting good wages.
Yeah, no, so, don't worry, I'm fully across that.
Yeah. So what I'm putting to you is that not only is the importance of what you're saying, that we're getting Chinese and Indian, but as the 7-Eleven latest 7-Eleven controversy is brought out, it's still important for and the Labor Party does this, to make sure that the wages that are paid in Australia are kept high. And I'm glad that you understand that.
No.
So you're happy to put that in your equation?
It's in there. Yeah. Don't worry, it's in there. It's not in the presentation. It's definitely in there. But I was sort of giving you a... my response to this as I was digging through the records, because wanting to find the first one, that's not where I expected to find it, and I didn't expect it to be so personal. I assumed that both Labor and Liberal were so tight on the post-war migration program that even European migration wasn't contested through the 50s and 60s. The fact that it is of interest. It may not tell you much about the present day, but it does tell you that this bipartisanship is not as permanent a feature of our federated history that people assume. Now, it is true, and in fact we do go almost from the get-go in the book, the idea of Australia as a high-wage society, as an egalitarian settlement. Remember, around the time of the gold rush, we were the first country in the world that got the trifecta. The vote for all men over age 21 and over, a secret ballot, which we invented, and an 8-hour day. And of course, by 1858, we've invented Aussie rules as well, but that didn't take on as well as it should have. But the other three were world-class reforms, which the rest of the world for the next 50 years could barely catch up to. And that is what Labor thought it was defending in the from the 1890s onwards. It thought it was defending a high wage society, but the economic story, and this is not this is presumably contestable, but I'm pretty confident of the data. The economic story is when we tried to control migration to protect wages, we actually didn't protect the economy, and ultimately wages fell. So it's a bit chicken and egg, but think about it, openness equals greater prosperity than the closed model. So the question of how you maintain that egalitarian compact with high migration, which is the period we're in now, that's obviously an important issue, but if it's framed as a racial policy, most people are going to start wondering whether we're repeating our past, and that would be my concern.
Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. I know there are many more questions, but I do urge you to come and join the queue at the back of the room and ask George yourself. Please join me in thanking George Megalogenis.
Thank you.